and welcome to A Pilgrimage of Poetry, your daily source of works throughout time. I hope you, along with many others, enjoy this podcast. Thanks for tuning in. The day is cold and dark and dreary. It rains and the wind is never weary. The vine still clings to the moldering wall, but at every gust the dead leaves fall, and the day is dark and dreary. My life is cold and dark and dreary. It rains and the wind is never weary. My thoughts still cling to the moldering past, but the hopes of youth fall thick in the blast, and the days are dark and dreary. Be still, sad heart, and cease repining. Behind the clouds is the sun still shining. Thy fate is the common fate of all. Into each life some rain must fall. Some days must be dark and dreary. That was The Rainy Day by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Welcome back to A Pilgrimage of Poetry. I am your co-host, Joanna. I'm here with Harrison, and today we are discussing Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, his life, and some of his works, and the people surrounding the creation of those works. So, all right, Harrison's going to start us off with some information about where he was born and his growing up years. So go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Joanna. Also, for those of you that are members of the Pilgrimage of Poetry Club over on the Patreon, we are doing a bonus episode after that, so if you want to stick around for that later. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, debatably one of the most beloved during his lifetime American poets, considered one of the fireside poets, which I'm actually not familiar with the comprehensive list of who's encapsulated in the fireside poets, but very, very loved, and I think the most popular and well-read poet in America, maybe of all time, but I'm not 100% on that, during his lifetime, consistently publishing and posting things for high dollar amounts, towards the end of his life and stuff like that.
I'll just insert here who the fireside poets are, for those who want to know. It is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, John Greenleaf Whittier, James Russell Lowell, William Cullen Bryant, and Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. So those would have been his group in 19th
Mainly
century.
contemporaries, honestly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Brief overview of kind of like the timeline and the growing up years of Longfellow. He was born in 1807 in the city of Portland, but not Portland, Oregon, as I'm used to, talking about because it's a few hours away. But Portland, what was then Massachusetts and what is now considered in the state of Maine, so East Coast. A very learned family, actually. His father was on the school board of a college that his grandfather had founded, and so grew up.
What was the name of that college?
Bodwin.
Just curious.
Bodwin College.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which actually he attended later on in life. At the age of 15, Longfellow was enrolled in Bodwin College, and
was that a college that taught a specific vocation, or was it more like what we know today? Like general education?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of college in the 1800s in general, 1700s, 1800s, wasn't necessarily focused on vocation in general. Like universities or colleges today might have special focuses on certain careers or certain, degrees, but general college atmosphere in the 1800s would have been generally more into the arts, into more of a general education, progressing all of things. So, as a part of college, you learn Latin, potentially Greek, philosophy, the maths, language, English language, obviously, sometimes linguistics, but not necessarily like social engineering or a medical degree or something.
So just like higher education in your general education that you would get.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. I had kind of forgotten about that.
I think specializations in college kind of became more of like an early 19th century or 20th century, 1900s thing, as it became kind of a requirement for even the middle or working class of America.
Because, I mean, in the 1800s, not everybody was going to college because if you were poor, well, I mean,
it was
eighth grade education for you if you can manage that. So
if you could. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, a difference than the college as we know today, largely.
Yeah.
Although
you could argue that it hasn't strayed too far from that because they still make you get more general education before like your specifics. So, I mean,
right. I mean, I
somewhat.
get that.
Yeah.
There are a lot of colleges that specialize in certain things, and the required portions of college are usually like the prerequisites to getting a bachelor's degree, right?
Yeah.
And spending 2 years in the general arts or in the general education in comparison to, the 4, 6, or 8 years that you would spend in the general education in the 1800s, it's a little bit disproportionate. But there are still schools today that highly prioritize the, quote, general education above like a vocational focus.
Right. Well, and it would make more sense in the 1800s because if people are only getting an 8th grade education, like there's that 4-year gap that we now have that is like filled in. So in my personal opinion, like for college now, like those extra years of general educations are not as necessary as maybe it was back then, or didn't have as much value. But that's just me. I mean, it
depends, because you know how the education has deteriorated over since in the past 100 years. You can see the stats of general knowledge that is possessed by a certain age bracket or demographic decreasing by leaps and bounds,
which is really unfortunate. I mean, just in general,
it is. Yeah. In my kind of interest and ventures, as I looked into other things, I've definitely seen a huge need in my own lookings for higher education, even in just the generals of history, linguistics, comprehension of even the English language, and stuff like that. Like, I need more of it, and
I think we could all use some more of that.
Yeah, exactly.
At this point, yeah. So maybe then in that way it has kind of balanced out. Like, okay, we have these 2 extra years of more general education, but we also don't have like the height of education that we would have had in like the first 8 years or whatever, which that's kind of sad, but is the reality.
Right, exactly. And honestly, I don't know that much about it, so I'll remove myself from like this is what it is. I'm honestly not sure. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think I kind of have a stereotype in my mind of what a non-college graduate would be like, and it's like, either farmhand or factory worker or some vocation where they speak with horrific slang.
So your definition of a non-college person is just like a redneck, or
kind of basically like the unlearned, don't care, ignorant, like kind of just like that. Yeah. I'm sure that is an unfair stereotype, and
I mean, I might just take that personally, to be honest. No,
if your grandfather was one of those people that wasn't, high school educated or college educated.
What are you saying about my family?
Bad. No, my bad. Yeah, exactly.
No, I think it also is directly related to how much effort people put into education outside of school. Like, just because they don't have a college degree doesn't mean they're not smart, but also just because they do have a college degree does not mean they're smart either. So.
Does not mean they're smart. Yes.
It's very individualized.
I have had several interactions. I'm like, you have a degree? How do you have a degree? Like, we're talking about high school stuff, and you're like, what? Like, should be pretty obvious.
Like, what school gave you that piece of paper and said you learned those things? Anyway, back to Longfellow and that college. Very different from now.
College. Okay. Like, what kind of a person do you think, based off of the general knowledge that you've amassed over, school life and then the few years subsequent, what kind of a person do you think of when you think of Longfellow? What stands out to you about what you know of his life and what he spent his time with and all that?
I don't know that I know a whole lot, but what strikes me first, and this is probably just mostly from reading what he's written, is that but he does seem well educated and very knowledgeable, and not just in like the practical things, but I would say also in like relational things. Like he doesn't seem blind to those intricacies, if you will. I would say a well-rounded person. I would also guess him to be a very caring person about people he knows and maybe even humanity in general, but that's what would strike me.
About the same, honestly. So I kind of had this idea of who Longfellow was, what he spent his life doing, and after watching I Heard the Bells. And after watching the film and reading some of his works, and obviously all of the poems I memorized in school growing up, I'm like, wow, Longfellow was he was a genteel man. I'll let you make up your own mind after this, but my opinion of him a little bit changed because he seemed to be a little bit more like a strategist, a little bit more aware.
Okay.
It
Do you
wasn't
mean
necessarily
like more
just about the
calculating,
art.
or
well, that's a nice way to put it.
Okay,
That's
okay.
Like that makes him sound good, but like it would not be above him to turn down a job because the pay wasn't high enough. And so it's like, nope, not gonna, which is not
So he
necessarily
had
a bad
standards,
thing.
like certain
He did have
standards.
standards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whether or
it
not
wasn't
they were
all
like
about
logical or not.
right. It wasn't in what my mind would have been, where it's like, my life is dedicated to this art form, and
He wasn't necessarily in it for the art, like an artist. He was there for some money too. Yeah.
He was incredibly gifted, but he knew how to leverage his gifts and his talents and his knowledge with a lot of personal benefit. Which again,
that sounds pretty smart, actually. But yeah,
I respect that. Yeah, for sure. And I think I get the impression that he mellowed some, became less outspoken. That's an impression I get. That's not reading off of his autobiography at all. You know what I mean? At age 15, he enrolls in Bowdoin College. The dude is smart. Like, Longfellow has a brain on his shoulders. He's pretty impressive. He learned Latin, French, English. Obviously had an amazing command of English. He read a lot of European poets and a lot of American poets, a lot of English poets. Actually, not a lot of American poets because there weren't a lot of American poets, but he read a lot of English
the ones
poets.
that were there. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And he seemed
Did
very
he have any
involved.
siblings?
I'm not sure. I think so. I think he had a brother.
Okay.
All of the knowledge of his life seems to be focused more on like after he graduated college, not his growing up years. His growing up years.
So that must have not had a huge effect on whatever he did after college. I mean,
at least his raising family didn't seem to play as active role later on in life.
Right.
One can always argue the significance of one's childhood and the development and everything else of their life. So he goes to college, gets the education. He was offered a position teaching at Bowdoin, I believe, of the study of languages, which is differentiated from linguistics. I'm not 100% sure on that. But
of like teaching multiple languages instead of like the structure of the English language or something like that.
I'm not sure. Because of how college was structured then, Latin and Greek were a big part of the general learning experience. And so there were certain languages that were required to know or to learn as you went through school. But linguistics, or the study of language, was also considered a part of that education as well. And so my guess is it was more the study of general language or the comprehensive overview of language rather than a specific language or the
maybe
teaching
more of like
of
history
languages.
of languages, kind of something along that line. Like how they're related or stuff like that, yeah.
This job offer, the professorship, was offered to him on the condition that he went on a European tour and gained comprehensive knowledge of a lot of European languages, right?
I mean, I'd sign up if my job required me to have a vacation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Turns out, his
an
father had to pay for
educational
it.
one. Oh.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so there were drawbacks.
It wasn't gratis. It wasn't just here's a bunch of cash and go tour Europe. It was like, you need to have this experience before you can have the job. They pushed for it, and he went to France and learned French. He learned Portuguese. I believe he learned Spanish. He already knew Latin. He might have learned, Italian, some rudimentary German, knew Greek. He knew like 7 languages. He was brilliant.
That's
he came
impressive.
back from the European tour, which overall I think cost his father somewhere around, I forget the number, I want to say somewhere around $30,000.
And like today's money.
In today's money, sort of a thing. That may not even be right though, because he spent multiple years in Europe, so it may be higher than that. That sounds really low.
Yeah.
As far as today's money, basically denied the professorship after getting all that experience.
Oh.
Because the salary wasn't high enough. It was going to be $600 a year, and so they negotiated a $700 a year salary for the position, plus an additional extra. I know, $700 a year.
I was gonna be like, is he even gonna like bother to pay his father back, or just be like, "Thanks, Dad, peace out"? Oh.
Doubt it. Honestly, I doubt it. But there was no record that I saw of the father's payment being a loan. My guess, it seemed to be more of like father investing in son's education and setting him up, and kind of just
that makes sense.
You know,
which I mean,
that line
in today's money, $30,000 isn't that much to invest in education.
That's extremely low. Yeah, which that wasn't college. That was more just lodging and travel.
True.
Around Europe.
Yeah.
At the age of 26 in 1831. He married Mary Stover Potter, and
do we know how they met?
I'm not sure. I think they grew up in a similar area, childhood friends, and then courted, and then married. They were married for a couple of years, 2 to 3 years, and then Mary died of miscarriage of their first child, and the child died as well, which broke Longfellow's heart for the first time.
Yeah,
in the story,
as can be expected.
Unfortunately, Footsteps of Angels was dedicated to his first wife, Mary. It's a beautiful piece. I won't spoil it for you because we'll drop it on the podcast, but I would definitely recommend going and reading through that or listening to it then.
Or both, you know. If it's that good, you know, multiple exposures can't be bad.
Exactly. He seemed to go through like a sabbatical from a lot of writing, but in the early years, before he was married, after his European tour, and then after he was married, and then after Mary Potter died, he spent most of his time and his professional career translating Latin and French textbooks into English. Like he was translating a bunch of works to the point where there was a certain book of poetry that I believe was written in French that if you were elite class American and you didn't have Longfellow's rendition or the translation of this copy of poetry, it was like, come on, what are you even doing? Like it was the masterpiece. It was the recognized work of translation, and that was what he was good at. Was translating because of his comprehensive knowledge of them.
The Bible, and you gotta have your blueback speller, and like,
yep.
And you have to have Longfellow's,
Longfellow's translation of French poetry,
translation of this one, and then you're accepted in society.
Now you're like, okay, we're taking you serious.
Forget who you know.
Yeah. Yeah. You can see in a lot of the poems that he wrote the influence of European poets. There's a certain cadence that generally fits best with the English language. I don't claim to be an expert on cadence, but iambic pentameter, if that rings a bell. And my understanding of that is simply where the emphasis falls on either the last word or the first syllable of the last word, but most of the time it's the last syllable of the line with the rhyme on that word, and that is distinctly an English language thing. And he uses that all the time, which is why his poetry is so often like sing-songy or has like the childlike rhyme, or what we associate with a lot of childlike poetry or stories, or
like the cadence and lilt of like regular speaking language. It just rhymes too.
If you're familiar with our little black book, a lot of common hymns and a lot of common tunes, a lot of the really basic stuff are in that same meter, are in that same kind of cadence and flow, with about 7 or 8 syllables per line, and you see that in a lot of his work. So that's
what those numbers mean. I always wondered.
7s and 8s? Yeah. So the song "Jesus Loves Me" is a 7s, and it's about the amount of syllables per line, and the tunes that associate with that is just the note fluctuation, but the tempo that fits with that amount of syllables, which is why we only have like 3 tunes for 11s. And every now and then we'll go through the songbook and you'll find like 88864, 88864, with that. It's like there's one tune that fits that because it has to match the cadence. But that's how we get along with our song, with our little black songbook, is because we have all these common sing-songy type poems, and the common meter, which is the CM in the little book, if you know it, is an 8. It's just a full 8s. So 4 lines of 8 syllables.
So now my question is which Longfellow poems can I now sing?
But no, that's the thing. Is the very common English rhyming scheme he utilized, which led, honestly, to him being critiqued as being childish a little bit, not having the depth or the brevity of more organic or authentic or intellectually astute poetry, as more. You
mean more confusing? No.
Sure. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, that's what I mean.
Okay, here's my thing. If you don't understand the poetry, what good is the poetry doing for you?
Sure. I understand that.
Yeah, I mean,
I could argue
is
for,
a place
like,
to
writer's
appreciate.
perspective.
Yeah, that's true.
So, like,
but
in one
from
sense,
a purely reader's perspective.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. If no one's going to read the poem that I've written, does it really matter? Do I have to use strict rhymes? That kind of thing. But he obviously published a lot of his own stuff.
Yes,
so.
It matters. Yeah. Well, I'm saying, as a writer, every poem you write, matters because you're putting effort into expressing something. Right. But, like, purely from a reader's perspective and, like, enjoyment, if you're, like, slogging through these long lines with complicated words and ideas and you're just not getting what it is, like, it almost ruins poetry. Like, you want to have some fun with it if you're out to enjoy it.
Seems a little bit less than, like, the organic expression of one's feel or whatever. Although I did read that it was very common for Longfellow to spend a significant amount of time trying to find the right meter to fit, like, the poem that he wrote. And he spent sometimes days trying to decide or finding the right rhyme scheme to match. Which seems funny because he has a lot of poetry that's a really simple rhyme. It's not that complicated. But he apparently put a lot of thought into it.
But I can understand that, where you're trying to think of something that's just right with the exact words that mean the exact things you want to mean. And sometimes the search for that is days long. Until it hits you in the middle of the night. And
it's like, I gotta write this down. Yeah, exactly.
Although I don't recommend writing things down in the actual dark, because I've done that before, and in the morning it's
what
just
is this chicken
gibberish.
Scratch? Okay. At the age of 36, Longfellow remarried a girl named Frances Elizabeth Appleton. There seemed to be a little bit of...
That is just a nice name. Can I just say that? Like, that is a memorable name.
I know. I was looking at it, like, it's pleasing to the ear. Sounds nice to say. The resources that I looked at said that they had 6 children together, but the names of their children vary as far as last name. So their oldest son is known as Charlie Appleton. Their younger children were known as Longfellows.
Yeah, was it perhaps anything to do with, like, carrying on the Appleton name, as in, like, she didn't have any brothers, or the name was dying out if her oldest didn't take it or something like that? I don't know. Can you even have preference at that time?
It may have just been a post-edited note in the blog that I looked at, or in the information that I looked at. But be that as it may, Longfellow married Frances. And this is probably, from when he married Frances on to pretty much, like, the next 10 to 12 years are probably the most well-known years of Longfellow's life. They're the most popular, even though a lot of his best, or a lot of his most well-known poems would have been written either in the early years of that, or just before that, or after that little time period and segment.
All right, that was part 1 of our discussion of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in the beginning of his life. Thanks for joining us. We will have part 2 up on Patreon immediately, so you can catch that right away. And if you're not part of our Patreon, it'll be out on Spotify and YouTube, other platforms, in 2 weeks here. So hopefully you come back to find out about the rest of his life, and we will see you there. If you liked this production, please leave a review. You can find us on YouTube or give us a follow on Instagram and Patreon at Pilgrimage of Poetry. To support the show, you can share it on any messaging platform or social media. As always, thank you for listening.